All right, welcome to our Friday office hour. We just realized here that I didn't post the exam 3 study guide. Now remember, exam 3 is much like exam 1. It's 50 questions. It's multiple choice matching and true false, and it's open notes. Okay, so all open notes, and but for some reason I totally forgot or didn't put the study guide, the new one, up. So I will be doing that later today. And I must be on spring break already because I didn't put, it's not on my flash drive. So we're not going to go over the questions, but I do want to talk about some concepts about evolution, and that will probably be on the study guide, that is on the study guide, but I just can't remember the specific wording or the way I put it. Um, this next exam will only cover, I think, 4 chapters: 11, 13, 14, 15, I believe, and it's our evolution and diversity section. So, just pay close attention as you're doing your reading, and, the videos and the little practice, the little quizzes, 1 point quizzes that you have to take, because some of those questions will appear on the exam. But again, it's open notes, open textbook, and just 50 points. So, and then your final exam is, again, closed notes, and it will cover the entire semester with an emphasis on the second half, with an even more emphasis on the last section, which will focus on the animal kingdom, and talk a little bit about like anatomy, physiology of the animal kingdom, mainly the human animal. It's kind of interesting because when you take different instructors, there's kind of leeway on what to focus on. So there's certain things that have to be covered, and but then there's given areas where they can kind of um, do whatever we want, because biology is pretty broad, so we can focus on many things. I teach anatomy and human anatomy, and I do a little physiology. So I do the human biology courses, and so my emphasis is on the human anatomy and physiology, and so the end section will be kind of focusing on that aspect. But if you take it with somebody else, maybe like Adam Green, who is the environmental um, biology instructor, and so he's going to put an emphasis on environmental studies. So I hope you're not disappointed. I kind of have a bias. I think everybody should know a little bit about their own human bodies, and so that's what we'll be focusing on. So this section though is evolution, and so I want to talk a little bit about that, and I'll go when I go home, I'll post that new study guide. So hopefully we'll cover these things. So evolution is genetic change in populations, or species, and it's over time, over generations. So oftentimes some people will say, I'm going to evolve. Well, people or individual organisms do not evolve. And so that's something really important to remember, that it's populations, or groups of individuals that live in the same area at the same time, the same species. Those groups can evolve, and you can see evolution in those groups. There's 2 types of evolution. Um, Microevolution, which is when you look at the alleles, you look at the individual alleles and how frequent they are in a population. So, you can kind of look at the microscopic view of evolution. and looking at the allele changes of a population over time. So if we're to look at all the individuals in a population and sorry, I'm getting over a cold. And looking at all the alleles in a whole population and look at it over time, then that would be like microevolution. But if we look kind of step back and we look at the bigger picture and we look at the species level, we're not looking microscopically, we're looking at whole species, and we're talking macroevolution. Of course, the father of evolution. Who's the father of evolution? Or evolutionary theory? Yeah, Darwin. So Charles Darwin came up with a theory of evolution that species living today descended from a common ancestral species. So they came from a common ancestor. And and of course with modifications, right? And as the environment changed, or different necessities changed for those species, then evolution occurred. So those that were this idea of those that were fittest or were best able to survive were those that survived and passed on their genes, and so there'd be a higher proportion or a higher frequency of those particular alleles or those particular genes in a population, and so those traits that those individuals had would be perpetuated or would go on, and that idea is called natural selection. Right? And so kind of someone who was also having those same ideas at the same time as Charles Darwin was Alfred Russel Wallace, and so he's kind of a name also in evolution, but Darwin was the first to really make it known. Publishing and whatnot. So maybe, do you have any questions, specific questions, or we could just talk about just these ideas, and hopefully I'll make a study guide that will cover that. So any questions? Nah. All right. And like I said, we talked about that the information is pretty straightforward, and hopefully the quizzes are, and the videos and things like that. So there's 4 what they call postulates that this evolution is really based on. And it's important that each of these populations have to have these characteristics, that the individual members of a population differ. So they can't all be the same. If they're all the same, then you're not going to evolve, right? Because they're all the same, and so there's nobody who's going to have an advantage. So there has to be variation in a population. So that's one of them. Some of these differences are going to make some individuals better able to survive and pass on their genes. Not only survive, but mate. So, and so, when we look at the differences between individuals, are there some characteristics that would help someone survive better, and therefore allowing those with those characteristics able to mate and to produce offspring? So that has to be part of it, part of the group, part of the population, in order to have evolution occur. A third thing is some individuals are going to survive. better than others. We kind of talked about that. So I combined two things, that some of the differences can be passed on. So number one, some of the differences can be passed on, right? They're traits. It's not like you scratch your hand and or you get a tattoo and is that going to make you survive better? Well, no, you can't pass that on to your offspring. So so that's one. Whatever the trait is you're looking at has to be inheritable. I mean, it has to be passed on, and then that it has to give you an advantage. That characteristic it has to make some survive and some less successful and less able to reproduce. And the last one is that the fate or what happens to an individual, it's not by luck or chance. So your likelihood of survival has to depend on that particular characteristic that we were looking at, or some characteristics that give you an advantage. And because of that, well, and that's natural selection. Okay, so it can't be like an earthquake that just a bunch of people die or a bunch of organisms die. That's chance or by luck. Not luck, by chance or bad luck. But it has nothing to do with well, maybe an earthquake. I don't know. If you run or you're smarter, then you can hide in certain places. I guess if there was if you ran right under a giant something that's going to fall down, I guess that might be a characteristic that would. Anyway, so so there are four. Well, they call them again postulates, but four situations that have to comply with a population in order for that population to evolve. So, how do we know that evolution is real? How do we know that that it's really happening? And so we can look at a lot of evidence for evolution, and we talked about that we can create it. We can artificially do it. So this is called artificial selection. So natural selection, nature selects, right? So whatever best allows someone to survive, we can, or those individuals survive and pass on their genes. So we can artificially do it. And artificial selection, we do it all the time in, if you're a farmer, you can choose like cows that have certain characteristics and allow them to breed. And so the next generation will have more of that characteristic, right? And then prevent other organisms from breeding. Or you can take flowers that have a certain characteristic that you like, and then grow those and allow those to and propagate those, and then change the population in the next generation. The fossil record. So fossils too, because we can see species, organisms that may be like an in-between species that maybe no longer exists, but we can see a species that might has characteristics of current species, but has characteristics of a species that's now extinct. So we can look at fossils and look at the record as far as how in the strata or the different layers in time relative to other organisms. Anatomy. So I like this, comparative anatomy. So we can look at structures of different organisms, different species that maybe have common structures. Okay, so common bones, like for example, the forelimbs or the forearms of different mammals, and birds are made of the same bones. So we can see the same organization. And even though their structures or their functions might be different, but we can see like a remnant of that common ancestor. Vestigial structures also are structures that maybe used to be important in earlier versions of organisms. So earlier, versions of organisms, and so or sometimes we have, or certain organisms have a characteristic or structure that has a function, but then another organism might have something similar, but it no longer has a function. So that's kind of like they call it evolutionary baggage that used to be there, but is no longer, no longer functioning. So signs of maybe a common ancestor. Embryology, if we look at development of embryos, that there's a lot of similarity and lots of different organisms and how they develop. And so that's evidence for evolution. And then now, as technology gets better, we can look more at the cellular, molecular biology and see the commonalities between different species. And there's a lot of similarities between the chemistry of living organisms and suggesting a common ancestor. So let's see, what else do we want to talk about? Population genetics, maybe a little bit about population genetics. Not sure if we're doing a lab on population genetics. See, I have all my stuff at home. I don't know why I didn't. I kind of want to run home and get it, but just because I don't have anything interesting to look at, so I don't want to talk too much. I wonder if we should have an office hour earlier after we come back from spring break, where you can have time to work on your study guide, and then we can go over stuff. Oh, okay. So, you had evolution and natural selection this week, didn't you? Oh, okay. I thought it was going to be after spring break. Okay, I didn't look at my schedule. Okay, so you've talked about all this kind of stuff, and was it fun? Or what did you think about it? What has been your favorite lab so far? You looked at birds? So, did you go outside? Oh, you looked at stuffed birds, and you were looking at. Did you guys do the where you had to run around and pick up things? Where you had to be like a population and you had to pick up beans? No, what kind of beans? What is it that you picked up? Did you use chopsticks and forceps? Oh, okay. And then you had to calculate what whether, or see if your population evolved, right? And it should have based on your characteristics. Okay, that's fun. So your mouthpiece was either a chopstick or a forceps, right? And so who did better, the forceps or the chopsticks? Oh, and a spoon too. There's a spoon. So did you kill off? Did you kill off a group? Was it the chopstick group that died? Did you eliminate from your population? Although I bet if you did the same lab in like Japan or China, I bet you the chopstick group would do pretty well, and the forceps group would die. But the spoon could just scoop up a whole bunch, huh? Okay. All right. You know what? I'm going to keep this short, since I don't have the study guide, and I can't remember what I had put on there, unfortunately. So do you have any questions? I will post that, and then you can go ahead and start working on that. And then the third exam is, I think, like 2 weeks after we have spring break. So yeah, so what we'll do is we'll have normal office hours after spring break when we come back, and we'll just get as far as we can on the study guide. It won't be a big deal because, again, it's an open note exam, so it's not going to be a big deal. On the last section, I'll be on top of that. Okay, hey, I want to thank you for being here. Thank you for coming to the office hours. And I don't really know how many students listen to it, but the class is doing really well overall, and that's really exciting to see. So, hey, you have a great spring break. Relax. All right, have a good one.